In Panoios, in my land, stands a great pagan sanctuary, shrouded in melancholy beneath the shadow of the oak trees. Carved from rough-hewn altars in the granite, it was there that the credulity of our ancestors found solace, sacrificing cattle to appease the wrath of the gods of old. At the foot of some of these altars of blood and hope, which I visit ritually whenever I can, votive inscriptions can still be seen. The Sanctuary of Panoios is located in Assento, in the union of the parishes of Constantine and Valnogueiras in the municipality of Vila Real. Classified as a national monument since 1910, the Crags of Panoios, as they were also known, stand at an altitude of 460 meters above sea level in a mountainous region characterized by granite outcrops from the early Paleozoic. The area corresponding to the Trás-os-Montes region has been inhabited continuously since the Paleolithic period. Among other peoples, the Lusitanians lived here until the Romans conquered the region in 127 BC, led by the general Decimus Junius Brutus, who would later be nicknamed Callaicus or Galaicus. However, Roman occupation was only consolidated after the Cantabrian Wars of Augustus between 29 and 19 BC. The area of Panoios was incorporated into the Conventus Bracarogustanus and placed under the control of the Municipium of Aquae Flaviae, present-day Chaves. In addition to the hot springs, this geographical region was a center for metal mining, with the rich gold mines of Três Minas and Jales located around 20 kilometers from Panoios. As early as late antiquity, the town is listed under its Latin name Pannonius in the Parochiale Suevorum of 569 AD as the seat of a parish belonging to the Suebi diocese of Braga. The origin of the name Panoios is not consensual, and hypotheses such as the derivation from Penas Auri, golden cliffs, have been suggested, although the original name Pannonios is not compatible with this explanation. Fernando Russell Cortez suggested that the name was due to the fact that it was the 7th Legion Gemina Felix that occupied this region, as confirmed by the inscriptions on the Roman bridge in Chaves, and that they were the ones who introduced Oriental cults here. This legion was transferred to Iberian lands from the region of Pannonia on the Danube, and the soldiers may have taken this name as a tribute. Geza Alfoldi, a Hungarian researcher who studied this sanctuary, proposed the possibility that the place name Panoios evolved from the Indo-European term pan or pen, which would mean water, but the absence of relevant springs in this location makes this hypothesis unlikely. The name Panoios is also associated with the archaic Portuguese term panoias, derived from bread in the sense of cereal used in the baking process, existing in Galicia under the form panoia. This place name appears elsewhere in present-day Portugal, namely in an old parish in the municipality of Braga, in the parish of Panoios de Cima in Guarda, and also in an old parish in the municipality of Ourique in the Alentejo region. In addition to the sanctuary, there may have been a settlement or even a Roman town here, as indicated by the various remains found over the centuries and often reused in the construction of modern buildings. These include columned shafts now embedded in walls, as well as epigraph stelae of different sizes and states of preservation, two of which have longer inscriptions. The first is dedicated to Flavius Albinus by his very pious wife Maximina, and the second is a dedication made by Tauracutiu, son of Apolter, to Trites, son of Mepto, who was buried here. The relative grandeur and importance of this place continued until the Suebi and Visigoth period, when the Visigoth kings Sisebut and Witteric minted coins in Panoias. Reports also mention the existence of anthropomorphic graves in this area, confirming a continuous occupation that extended into the Middle Ages. Thus, Panoias and its sanctuary would have been a pilgrimage destination that was part of a wider and very important group during Roman times, encompassed within the municipality of present-day Chaves, and located close to one of the largest and richest auriferous mining centers on the Iberian Peninsula. Over the centuries, this place has generated great popular interest, leading to its association with legends of enchanted moors and the usual ideas of hidden treasures, but it has also garnered the attention of some of the first researchers into Portugal's archaeological heritage. After the foundation of the Royal Academy of Portuguese History in December 1720, by decree of King John V of Portugal, that body ordered the Villarreal Town Council to provide a detailed report compiling information on the places of historical interest in the region. In 1721, the licentiate José Moutinho de Aguiar and the clerks José Taveira de Mesquita and António da Cunha sent a set of documents to the Academy, compiled under the title Relação de Villarreal e o seu termo, which included descriptions and drawings of the sanctuary of Panoias. A similar request was sent by the Academy to various parish priests in towns all over the country, and in 1722 António Rodrigues de Aguiar, priest of the Church of São Pedro de Valnogueiras in Panoias, sent a document entitled Relação da Freguesia de São Pedro de Valnogueiras, which included 20 pages of text and 8 drawings depicting the rocks of the sanctuary of Panoias. Later, in 1732, Jerónimo Contador de Ergote, a founding member of the Royal Academy of Portuguese History, read both reports and published extracts from them describing the carved and inscribed outcrops. In the first volume of Memórias para a História Eclesiástica do Arcebispado de Braga, Ergote, who never visited Panoias in person, accompanied the text with 11 illustrations by Gabriel François Louis de Brie, based on the drawings previously included in the municipal report, and adding several changes in neoclassical style that made them less reliable. The descriptions and drawings in these 3 works don't always coincide and suggest the existence of sections of the sanctuary that have been lost over time as a result of destruction and vandalization. For this reason, it's important to try to situate them in relation to the sanctuary's present reality in order to understand what they correspond to, which descriptions are truer, and what has actually been lost since the beginning of the 18th century. The most notable rock in the whole complex, representing the most iconic image of this sanctuary, is still preserved as it was described almost 300 years ago, with the exception of a large cartouche consisting of a flattened surface for possible use as a support for an inscription carved there, which would have been located on its eastern face. 9 steps carved out of the north side of the crag allow climbing to its top, where there are 5 large rectangular basins carved into it, as well as a small square-shaped depression measuring 40 by 40 centimeters. Regarding this smaller depression, the rector, António Rodrigues de Aguiar, suggests that it could be the seat of 2 palms and a half for some stone that was placed there, an idea that has been echoed today by some researchers as being the socket for placing an altar. All the illustrations also show the stepped, square-shaped recess that borders 2 of the cavities, as well as the asymmetrical tank that crosses it diagonally, at the bottom of which, in these 3 representations, there is a small rectangular basin. Here too, on this segment, the rector raises the possibility that these are the foundations of a wall that would surround the perimeter of the 2 largest basins, a hypothesis that is also defended by some current authors. Rodrigues de Aguiar also provides an explanation for the destruction of the cartouche, described as being 10 meters long and 4 meters wide, which would have been caused by the use of an explosive in an attempt to reach a supposed treasure that existed there. The rector suggests that the surface of the cartouche was flat, but that it would never have been filled with any inscriptions. According to Rodriguez Colmenero, it is also possible that the inscription, instead of being carved in relief like the others here, could have been painted on the stone. All the authors agree that this rock is oriented towards the south, compared to the one previously analyzed. The municipal writers and Ergot mistakenly indicate that it is made of marble, describing it as being close to the ground, although in the illustrations it appears as a protruding rock. All the descriptions mention that the rectangle carved out of the rock must have had a lid with hinges or something similar. This rock has been preserved to this day. Again, everyone agrees on the orientation, farther south, and the distance, 12 rods from the second rock. Most of them also agree that there is an idol niche protected by iron beams at the entrance at the top of the stairs. In their illustration, the municipal writers present 2 cartouches without inscriptions, one on either side of the staircase. Rodrigues de Aguiar, on the other hand, notes only one near the steps, but points out another one further to the left. On this rock, which can still be seen today, there would have been an aedicula, a small temple built on the rectangular flattened area containing cavities for storing sacred objects. No trace remains of the building's architectural elements, which have certainly been reused over the centuries as building materials. Rodrigues de Aguiar considers a group of 2 crags described by the municipal writers and by Ergot to be just one. One of them had an oblique square cavity, and the other had a small staircase and an open gap in the side section that was left unfinished. This rock was probably obliterated for the construction of modern buildings, leaving only a strange cavity with an oblique profile, which may correspond to an attempt to start building a tunnel, which was then abandoned. The report of the Villarreal Council's informants, and consequently that of Ergot, places this outcrop 4 rods to the east of the previous one, totally confusing its location. On the other hand, Rodrigues de Aguiar places it 16 rods away from the rock, presumably to the south, as his description moves in that direction, corresponding to a similar structure that can still be seen in the sanctuary today. Both versions coincide in their description of the complex, with the rector detailing that the place had been remodeled as a threshing floor for rye and maize, function that it had performed for several years. The basins, which had been filled with cement, were completely cleaned today to reveal their original appearance. This rock is partially preserved and corresponds to the site of the largest of all the buildings in this complex. It is located next to the sector where all the epigraphic inscriptions that have survived to this day can also be found. What the municipal writers and Ergot report as 3 disconnected segments, oriented to the east, the rector of Valnogueiras interrelates in a single illustration and description. He also indicates that this rock, which he designates as E1, is located at a distance of 1.5 meters from D1 and is accessible via a small staircase carved into the granite with 3 steps. On its eastern side there was a sign which, due to the ravages of time, we can no longer make out the letters on it. In another inscription, Rodrigues de Aguiar indicates that the cavities, which he calls arques, were called eternal lakes, and that they were made by Gaio and Caio and Calpurnio Rufino. He mentions the round urns and the existence of a half-Greek and half-Latin inscription, which we can't quite make out. In his description, the rector of Valnogueiras states that to the right of the round urn number 8, under the Greek sign on the E1 crag, there are many people who are alive today, and reminded him that there was a cave underneath the outcrop, the mouth of which was to the right of the Greek sign, or a little further down to the part of the 11th sign to the south, which the ploughman covered in order to cultivate the land adjacent to the said rock, that there was a cave underneath the said crags, and that they don't know where it ended, but that it was underneath the rock of the feet to the east. Another opening could be seen which corresponded to the top entrance, and from the entrance to this opening the cliff continues for a distance of more than 32 meters, from west to east, where it ends at a height. 2 of the parts described by Ergot still exist, but section H, facing southeast, was destroyed and caused the disappearance of one of the inscribed cartouches which, were it not for the transcriptions recorded in these historical accounts, would have been lost forever. This rock, which has now disappeared, would have been in the area of the entrance hall of the current visitor reception center at the sanctuary of Panoias. The descriptions mention the existence of 3 carved footprints located next to a square cavity that was connected to a channel carved into the rock, which would lead the liquid deposited in the cavity to the edge of the cliff, causing it to flow out. This is where the aforementioned tunnel, described by the locals to the rector of Valnogueiras, would have its exit. This rock also had a larger rectangular cavity. Both accounts attribute a utilitarian purpose to this crag, which is located within the town of Valnogueiras and outside the area currently delimited by the sanctuary. It has also disappeared today, with the exception of some traces detected by Rodrigues Colmenero. Rodrigues de Aguiar had many doubts about its usefulness, pointing out that it was about 500 paces away or by musket shot on the south side of a hill, where there was a rock that would have been an olive mill, but it had no covers. More than a century later, the British writer William Henry Giles Kingston travelled through the north of Portugal, passing by the sanctuary of Panoias, leaving a description of this visit in the 2nd volume of his work Lusitanian Sketches of the Pen and Pencil, published in London in 1845. As described by previous visitors, Kingston attests to the presence of marble columns, capitals, and slabs scattered around the site, most of which had already been taken to Vila-real and to the church of São Pedro de Valnogueiras, where they were reused as building materials. In his book, the English author describes the following events. Ascending another hill, we attempted to reach the site of the ancient city of Panoias, which we were anxious to visit. We now discovered that our guide knew nothing of the road and were wandering over the wild trackless hills almost in despair when we encountered a countryman dressed in a straw cloak, wooden shoes and a hoe on his shoulder, who civilly undertook, without expectation of reward, to conduct us thither. It was fortunate we found so good a guide, for we might have passed close to the spot without observing it. After we had crossed the stream and ascended to the summit of a rugged mound, we found ourselves before a high rounded rock with steps cut in one side of it. "There, senor, is Panoias," said our guide, and highly delighted with a small piece of silver, he retired. Dismounting from our mules, we ascended by the steps to the top of the rock. Shallow steps were carved all round it. In the center is an oblong altar with a space for the officiating priests to stand, and on each side of the altar are two tomb-like hollows with edges as if lids had fitted onto them, doubtless for the reception of the bodies of the victims. The rocks are of hard granite, and time has scarcely even rounded off the edges of these tanks or tombs. We at once pronounced this altar as owing its origin to the Carthaginians, who are said to have peopled Portugal, and that it was employed for the sacrifice of human victims. On this rock we might discover no inscription. We observed several cottages near the spot, and a woman who came out of one of them civilly to show us where the inscriptions were to be found, assured us they were of the time of the Moors, pointing out 2 footmarks on the rock made respectively by male and female of that ancient people, supposed magicians. The vulgar invariably attribute all remains of past ages to the time of the Moors. While we were pursuing our researches, the padre of the village came up, politely offering to lead us to some other spots worth seeing. He first took us to a tomb in a garden cut in the solid rock, with places formed to contain the head and shoulders. It must have been made either for a female or a very small man. Our reverend guide told us that when opened it was full of a white substance, which looked like marble but which was very soft and glittered in the sun. Numerous other tombs had been brought to light, some with skeletons in them, which of course fell to pieces on being exposed to the air. Coins are constantly discovered, and the padre made me a present of one he had lately found, with a gladiator on one side and the head of an emperor on the other, but the inscription was illegible. Marble columns, capitals, and tablets are also frequently turned up, but the greater part of the ruins of the city were carried away to build the walls of Vila-real. The last tower was short time ago destroyed to construct a belfry for the church, and the padre had placed a Corinthian capital on one side of the top of it, and a lump of the glittering substance found in the tomb on the other. Throughout the 19th century, this place would receive more notable visitors, namely Alexandre Herculano and Gabriel Pereira, in a century that would culminate with the important visit, in 1888, by José Leite de Vasconcelos, a pioneer of archaeology in Portugal and later founder of the National Archaeological Museum. This researcher dedicated several texts of the magazine O Arqueólogo Português, which he founded, to Panoias, as well as multiple pages throughout the 3 volumes of his seminal work Religiões da Lusitânia, Religions of Lusitania. Although classified as a national monument since 1910, the site was only cleared in 1942, and a topographical survey was carried out in 1951. Since then, the site has deserved more attention from national and foreign researchers. The land was acquired by the state in 1993, fenced off in 1995, and cleared of the presence of some modern buildings. In 2004, the ticket office, bookshop, and a small auditorium were opened, making the site accessible to visitors. However, to date, no archaeological excavation using current methodologies has ever been carried out here. The sanctuary of Panoios had a total of 5 cartouches with epigraphic inscriptions, 4 of which have survived to the present day. The inscription that was destroyed was fortunately recorded in the 18th century report sent to the Royal Academy of Portuguese History. All the inscriptions are concentrated on the same rock, located in the southern part of the complex, with 4 of them entirely in Latin and 1 containing text in Greek and Latin. Since the 18th century, various interpretations of these inscriptions, all quite damaged by the effects of erosion, have been put forward, reflecting interpretative differences that matched each researcher's reading of the space. The key moment in this process came in 2014 with the publication of the results of the application of an innovative technique for collecting and filtering 3-dimensional data called the morphological residue model, which made it possible to recover all the information contained in the 4 surviving inscriptions. This research, carried out by Maria João Santos, Hugo Pires and Orlando Sousa, has revealed previously unknown data that has changed the available knowledge about the textual content of these epigraphic inscriptions. The first inscription refers to the dedicant, called Gaius C. Calpurnius Rufinus, who is identified by the title Vir Clarissimus, Illustrious Man, designation associated with members of the senatorial order. It mentions the offering of the lake, which here refers to the basin or adjacent cavity carved out of the rock, and to the Aedes, temple or shrine that had been built next to it. The second inscription, written in Greek and Latin, is located next to a circular cavity and again indicates the name of the offerer, Gaius C. Calpurnius Rufinus, as well as his title, containing a dedication to the god Serapis, of Egyptian origin, to the goddess Kore, the Greek name by which the goddess Persephone, Proserpina in Roman mythology, was also known, and to the mysteries. The third cartouche has a longer inscription in Latin, with the same offerer as the previous ones, dedicating the lake, adjacent rectangular cavity, to the gods and goddesses, indicating that sacrificial victims were cremated there in fulfillment of a vow. It also indicates that the nearby temple was dedicated to all the divinities, including those of the Lapithai. The next inscription, located perpendicular to the previous 3, is once again offered by Gaius C. Calpurnius Rufinus, dedicating the adjoining rectangular cavity and the temple to Serapis and Isis, a goddess of Egyptian origin, as well as to the other gods and goddesses. The fifth inscription, which has now disappeared, came to us through the accounts drawn up by the writers of the Vila-Real City Council and the rector of Valnogueiras in the first quarter of the 18th century. It contained a dedication of the slaughtered and immolated victims to the gods, explaining part of the sacrificial process involving cremation of the entrails in the square cavities and pouring the blood into the adjacent holes. From this epigraphic collection, some elements stand out that help us to understand the use that was made of this space, but several doubts also emerge. Who or what were the Lapithai and their deities mentioned on the third inscription? who was Gaius Calpurnius Rufinus, who appears as the central figure in 4 of the inscriptions. Why were cults to Oriental deities such as Serapis and Isis, or to the Greek goddess Kore, being held at the western end of the Roman Empire? The origin of the Panoios sanctuary undeniably predates Romanization, a fact confirmed by the marks on some of the rocks that point to ancestral beliefs and rituals. The sacralization of the landscape, be it hills and mountains or cliffs and rocks, is a well-known phenomenon in the history of religions. The people who lived in the region of what is now the Vila-real district worshipped the Marão mountain range, as confirmed by an epigraphic inscription from Roman times, which recorded a vow to Reva Marandicu. Reva is an indigenous deity who appears in other inscriptions associated with the Laroco mountain range further north. We know little about the rituals of these peoples, or even the meaning of the signs they left behind. The cup marks carved into the great rock of Panoios, to which small channels have been added, could be used to contain liquids, but which ones? Blood from sacrificial victims? Water with some sacred meaning like rain, for example? The phenomenon of cup marks, which dates back to the Neolithic period and continued during the Metal Age, is often associated with sacred sites and with places where there are rock engravings. They can appear isolated, grouped, or even interconnected through small channels or grooves carved into the rock. Cup marks are also depicted on small stones, perhaps mobile pieces used as funerary offerings or as amulets for individual transport. There are dozens of theories about its meaning and usefulness, but its association with places of worship is indicative of its religious importance. Another sculptural manifestation are the podomorphs, popularly known as footmarks, which also appear in the sanctuary of Panoios, like many other places of worship and rock art throughout the country. Once again, its meaning is unknown. At this site we can also see an apparent serpentine shape, a motif that can be found at various prehistoric sites, as well as a rock engraving which Rodriguez Colmenero called branch-shaped, both forms deliberately carved into the rock and which would have been formed part of the sacred space of the pre-Roman sanctuary. During the Bronze Age, in Trás-os-Montes, there are also small stones carved in what appears to be a solar or stellar representation found in ritual and funerary contexts such as in dolmens. Another shape that appears in stone carvings is the triskelion, a three-armed spiral that is often associated in popular culture with the Celts, but its origins go back much further, being found throughout the Mediterranean, in India and all over the European continent. It was used for millennia and persisted until the Middle Ages. The interpretation of its meaning is diverse, with some reading it as a solar symbol and others as a representation of the cycles of life, birth, death, and rebirth. The third inscription from Panoios contains the passage Numina Lapitearum, which has generated some controversy over its interpretation. Researcher Amilcar Guerra suggested that the term was derived from the Latin lapis, stone or rock, thus designating deities linked to the rocky nature of the site. Other readings consider that it designates local deities, the Lapiteae, who could be linked to water like nymphs. There is also the possibility that it is the name of an indigenous population, the Lapiteas, who would have lived here and whose deities were invoked by Calpurnius Rufinus in the inscription he had created as a way of integrating the local cults into the Panoios sanctuary. With regard to Gaius Calpurnius Rufinus, the Hungarian historian Géza Alföldi suggested the possibility that this figure came from Asia Minor, more precisely from Perga, in the region of Pamphylia in present-day Turkey, an area where there is evidence of the name Calpurnius Rufinus, and because of the Greek inscription where devotion to Serapis appears in clear observance of the Alexandrian archetypes. Archaeologist Antonio Rodriguez Colmenero interprets his name as Gaius C. Calpurnius Rufinus. The C that appears between Gaius and Calpurnius is read by him as possibly meaning Kai Filius, meaning son of Gaius. As for the acronym VC, it is generally interpreted as Vir Clarissimus, indicating that it was a personality from the Ordo Senatorialis, the senatorial order. This designation creates some problems as to the explanation for the presence of such a figure in Panoias, since it should be related to metal mining in this region, which would make him a member of the so-called equestrian class, a social position that is too high. It has therefore been suggested that Calpurnius Rufinus was a legatus juridicus, an official of the provincial government, or a censor of the senatorial order sent on an extraordinary mission to order the province, or finally, a legatus Augusti propraetor of the province, on a journey of inspection and devotion to Panoias, not lacking predecessors. Colmenero favors the latter hypothesis, since this illustrious man was imbued with the new faith in Oriental divinities, becoming an apostle of these doctrines, merging them in Panoias with pre-existing local beliefs. The cult of Serapis was formally founded between the reigns of Ptolemy I Soter and Ptolemy II Philadelphus between 306 and 282 BC, who introduced him as the tutelary deity of the city of Alexandria, then the capital of Egypt during the so-called Ptolemaic dynasty. This devotion became an important political and religious instrument for bringing together the Egyptian and Greek populations in the veneration of a syncretic deity, which brought together characteristics from both cultural and religious traditions. The legend concerning the origin of the deity Serapis, which appears in the treatise Isis and Osiris by the Greek historian and philosopher Plutarch, emphasizes the association made between the Greek god Pluto, later corresponding to the Roman Hades, and the name Serapis given by the Egyptians. Other accounts have sought to associate the origin of the cult of Serapis with Alexander the Great, probably as a way of legitimizing his importance, associating him with the figure of the notable conqueror and founder of the city of Alexandria. However, the origin of Serapis is almost certainly Egyptian. Since 3000 BC, the cult of the Apis bull, Hap in Egyptian, a term linked to the movement of the Nile floods, which had Memphis as its main focal point, had great importance, being a representation of the manly strength of the reigning pharaoh and constituting the divine power of the god Ptah, who presided over that Egyptian city. Historiographical sources say that Alexander himself made a sacrifice before the bull Apis as a way of emphasizing his respect for local traditions. The divine bull was used in royal ceremonies, namely the coronation and the Heb Sed, celebration of the pharaoh's reign, performing a ritual race together with the maximum leader of ancient Egypt. After the death of each bull, mourning was decreed for 70 days, during which time the sacred animal was mummified, using monumental embalming tables carved out of alabaster especially for this purpose. They were then taken on a boat to Saqqara, where they were buried in huge sarcophagi inside the Serapeum, or abode of Apis, a place of central importance to Egyptian religion. This process led to the identification of the Apis bull with Osiris, god of the dead, and he became known as Osir-Hap, dead Apis, which later gave rise to the Hellenized name Serapis. Here, Osiris would not designate the Egyptian god Osiris himself, but would be used as a title associated with the process of death of the sacred bull, followed by their mummification and regeneration, constituting a profound mystery that marked the triumph over death and pointed the way to immortality. Thus, the Apis bull remains an essential element in the iconography of Serapis, emphasizing his chthonic powers and the mystery of his regeneration in the netherworld. However, this deity has more characteristics inherited from other deities, such as Ptah himself, supreme god of Memphis and ruler of creation. This god was depicted with a long rectangular beard, a symbol of sovereignty replicated exclusively by the pharaohs. He was a chthonic god from the lower world, presiding over the fertility of the land and the growth of vegetation, but also to the riches of the earth, including gold reserves, covering not only the extraction of these materials, but also their transformation into objects. Remember the proximity of Panoios to important mining complexes. He was also the supreme god, the forerunner of creation itself, who conceived the world and connected heaven and earth. Serapis also incorporates characteristics brought from the cult of Osiris, which took root in ancient Egypt in all the main necropolises, either on their own or in the form of composite deities that combined the characteristics of two or more gods. Osiris symbolized the resurrection offered to the righteous in the afterlife. Thus, syncretism between different cults and multiple divinities was something that already existed in ancient Egypt and which remained alive during the Ptolemaic period, so the emergence of a deity like Serapis was nothing new. Another cult that was firmly established in Greco-Roman times was that of Isis, with whom the cows in Memphis that gave birth to the bull Apis were identified. These were also the object of a cult and a special burial, in this case in the Iseum, installed in a place close to the Serapeum of Saqqara. In addition, Horus, divine son of Isis and Osiris, was also included in the Alexandrian triad of Serapis under the name Harpocrates, a term derived from the Egyptian Hopakhered, meaning Horus' child, symbolizing the reigning pharaoh and the living heart of the supreme god. Kore, also known as Persephone in Greek mythology and corresponding to the Roman Proserpina, was a goddess, daughter of Zeus and Demeter. She became the queen of the underworld after being kidnapped by her uncle Hades, god of the underworld and the dead. Rescued by Hermes, she ended up living in the hot seasons on Olympus, returning to the underworld in the other half of the year. This existence between two worlds has led to its association with funerary rituals, but also with the seasons, flowers, and fruit, who emerge in spring like Kore returning to the celestial light of Olympus. This myth was at the origin of the so-called Eleusinian Mysteries, a set of initiation rites that were originally celebrated in the town of Eleusis, near Athens, Greece. It is not known when this tradition began, but it gained prestige in the Hellenistic and Roman periods. This mystery cult is sometimes referred to simply as the Mysteries. This is how it appears in the second inscription in Panoios. It involved an initial phase, known as the Lesser Mysteries, in which participants were qualified for initiation by sacrificing piglets to Demeter and Persephone, after which they ritually purified themselves in the river Ilissos. At the end of this process, the participants were considered Mistai, minor initiates, and could witness the greater mysteries. During this phase, which lasted 10 days, preliminary sacrifices were made and a group of ephebes carried the sacred objects of initiation, accompanied by a procession. The Mistai then enter the enclosure after washing their hands in holy water. Part of the ritual involved the participants walking to the harbor of Athens, where they purified themselves in the seawater and cleaned piglets. After returning to the city, the animals were sacrificed. Two priestesses then led a procession involving celebrations and dancing, which ended in the city of Eleusis. The Mistai carried torches on their way there. Afterwards, the participants gathered in a building, the Telesterion, in a ritual involving the ingestion of a drink called Kykeon, which, according to various experts, has psychoactive effects, probably through the inclusion of barley infected with claviceps. This fungus contains ergotamine, an alkaloid that is said to be at the root of the intense experiences the initiates of the Eleusinian Mysteries went through. Inside the Telesterion, the Mistai would go through the major initiation, consisting of the Dromena, things done, which would include a dramatization of the myth of Demeter and Persephone, by the Deiknoumena, things shown, which would consist of displaying sacred objects to the participants, and Legomena, things said, a set of comments that accompany the objects shown. The ceremony also included a sacrifice of bulls, the meat of which was distributed among the participants, the offering of libations to the dead, and the ritual emptying of 2 vessels towards the east and west. The cult of Serapis spread from Alexandria, solidifying itself as a divinity that united the Egyptians with the Greeks, expanding throughout the Mediterranean, together with the mysteries associated with it due to its chthonic nature inherited from Osiris. This deity was progressively associated with others, such as Dionysus, Hades, and Asclepius, as well as with Helios, the sun god, and even with Zeus, the supreme deity of the Greek pantheon. The goddess Isis, whose cult extended from Egypt to Greece and then Rome, also appears through the identification of Osiris with Serapis as the latter's wife, and their cults were often associated, as was the case in Panoias. The cult of Serapis spread via merchants, sailors, and soldiers from the Greek world, and was then passed on to the Romans after their occupation of the ancient Hellenic territories, namely Greece and its islands, as well as the whole of Asia Minor and Sicily. This process was clearly the result of the context provided by the dynamics of the Roman world, in which the military legions were made up of elements from all over the Mediterranean, associated with the movements of traders and state officials through the impressive network of roads, as well as by river and sea, promoting the spread of cultural beliefs and traditions across a vast geographical area. In the Iberian Peninsula, there is clear evidence of the presence of Oriental cults during the period of Roman occupation, with worship of Serapis and Isis appearing together, sometimes associated with Kore, daughter of Demeter, demonstrating the fusion between the cult of Egyptian divinities and the divinities of Eleusis. An inscription dedicated to Isis is known in Bracara Augusta, Braga, and was later incorporated into the exterior wall of the city's cathedral. In Aquae Flaviae, Chaves, there is an altar to Isis and another to Cybele. There are also possible place names in the region that could reveal a heritage linked to these deities, particularly in the village of Isei, possibly derived from Iseum, and Sirapicus, a name that appears in several places and villages in the region and which may be linked to the Latin adjective Serapicus. The inscriptions of the Panoias sanctuary, which refer to the introduction of the cult of Serapis in the region by Calpurnius Rufinus, date from the period between the end of the 2nd century and the beginning of the 3rd century AD, when the emperor Septimius Severus reigned. He was a fervent supporter of the cult of Serapis, and even traveled to Egypt to visit the sacred sites associated with this deity, bringing his physical representation in official iconography closer to the image of this god. The proximity between Panoias and the important mining complex of Trjmenes, where the process of extraction by Ruina Montium involved huge amounts of slave labor, required the presence of a military unit to coordinate and police this exploitation. These soldiers may well have had an interest in the establishment and utilization of the Panoias sanctuary. The Panoias Sanctuary is the largest and most complete of its kind in the entire Iberian Peninsula and is a unique archaeological site on an European scale. Nonetheless, there are other rock-cut sanctuaries in present-day Portugal that can help in contextualizing Panoias, both through epigraphic inscriptions, which offer clues to the beliefs and rituals of the peoples who inhabited the region before the Roman occupation and which were later Romanized, and through the types of structures carved into the rock and the sites chosen to do so. In terms of epigraphy, one of the most important examples in Portugal is the Cabeço das Fraguas inscription in the municipality of Guarda, which is engraved on a cliff at an altitude of around 1020 meters, facing east. The inscription, dating from the 2nd century AD, is written in Latin characters but in a Paleo-Hispanic language called Lusitanian, making possible mention of local deities, Trebopala, Treberuna, and the aforementioned Reva, in whose name specific animal sacrifices should be made as offerings. Another very important inscription is that of Lemos de Moledo, carved on a rock in the parish of Moledo in the municipality of Castro Daire. It constitutes one of the few epigraphic evidences of the so-called Lusitanian language and is one of the most studied inscriptions for understanding the pre-Roman peoples of the Iberian Peninsula. It dates back to the 2nd or 1st century BC, when the Iberian Peninsula was being Romanized. The inscription is written from top to bottom in Latin characters, but Latin is not used and unknown terms are mentioned, which can identify deities, communities, or even places, indicating a phase of cultural and linguistic transition between the indigenous people and the Roman occupiers. There are several important instances of rock-cut sanctuaries in northern Portugal. There are some examples in the municipality of Miranda do Douro, including the sacred site of Santo Albino, where we can see a set of cup marks, a basin with a seat, and a kind of vat carved into the granite. Also in the municipality of Miranda do Douro, in the town of Ifanes, is the Fraga da Rodela, a sacred site that dates back to the Iron Age and is characterized by steps carved into the granite rock, as well as a rectangular tank carved into another larger rectangle. In the town of Garfo, in the municipality of Povo de Lanhoso, stands a curious rock-cut sanctuary, also known as Penedo das Pias, composed of a set of 3 tanks dug into the top of a rocky outcrop, 2 of which are rectangular and the largest is T-shaped. In the surrounding area there are other structures carved into the rocks, which could be tanks or graves, indicating the existence of a larger sacred space. It is usually placed in the Galaic Roman context, but an archaeological investigation of the site is still needed to find out more about its origin and use. Further north, in the town of Vilar de Perdizes, is the Pera Escrita altar, a granite outcrop on which 3 steps have been carved, leading to a set of 3 notches carved into the rock in the shape of an E, with a rectangular cavity carved in the center. It must have been a place of worship for the indigenous populations during the Iron Age and was later Romanized, as confirmed by the inscription on one of the altar's faces, in which the Legion 7 Gemina consecrates it to the god Laruku, associated with the mountain of the same name, Jupiter's companion. Nearby, 2 Roman altars with epigraphic inscriptions were found in 1969 during the opening of a road, one dedicated to the god Laruku and the other to Jupiter. Embedded in a wall of the Church of St. Michael of Vilar de Perdizes, hidden by the choir loft and only visible through a trapdoor, there is a stone stele that some consider to be a representation of the god Laruku. The virile male figure holds a hammer in his right hand, a symbol associated with thunder, perhaps hence its connection in the inscriptions to Jupiter, also the Roman god of thunder, placing it in parallel with deities from the Celtic universe such as Dagda or Sucellus. But it is in Valpassos, in the town of Ugeriz, that we can find the rock-cut sanctuary with the most direct similarities to the one in Panoias. Also popularly known as Pias dos Moros, it consists of 2 rectangular tanks arranged in an east-west direction, which were excavated in parallel in a granite outcrop close to the ground. The largest is 2.5 meters long and the smallest is 2.02 meters, with similar widths and depths. On the same rock, two parallel sets of steps have been carved in a north-south direction, which some interpret as steps for access or circulation in the enclosure. Others read them as fittings to support the ashlars of a small temple that, in Roman times, would have been built there to delimit the sacred space. An inscription in Latin letters with the characters APA DAV was identified in the flat section on the left-hand side of the larger cavity. Additionally, on the left side of the smaller cavity there are also inscribed characters, but interpreting the meaning of both is impossible without further investigation. All the available data suggests that this sanctuary was used and modified during the Roman occupation, perhaps corresponding to the actualization of a space that was already sacred to the indigenous population. In several outcrops near the rock of the tanks and steps, we can see multiple rounded cavities, which could be the result of erosion, but which in some cases show signs of having at least been honed to reinforce their circular or oval shape. Any conclusions about the origin, construction phases and utilization of the Ejrij rock-cut sanctuary can only be achieved after a complete archaeological exploration of this important site, something that, here too and like others we have identified previously, has never taken place. Combining the information we have on Panoias and its epigraphic inscriptions with the data provided by sites like the ones we've just seen allows us to draw some relevant conclusions in an attempt to understand these ritual spaces, who used them and how they were used. Inscriptions such as the one at Cabeço das Fraguas confirm that animal sacrifices were made to the gods, and there were specific instructions for this. The immolation of animals such as pigs, sheep and bulls was also part of the Roman ritual, the so-called Suave Taurilia, whose name results from the agglutination of the Latin terms for the animals involved. In this ritual aspect, the beliefs of the local people overlapped with those of the Roman occupiers, perhaps because they all had a common Indo-European origin, which facilitated the creation of religious syncretisms and common cult spaces. In these rock-cut sanctuaries, of which Panoias is the most powerful example, it is impossible not to notice the importance of the sacralization of natural elements and landscapes by indigenous peoples. This is expressed both in the use of outcrops and rocks as sacred and cultic spaces, and in the worship of deities linked to mountains, such as Marão or Louroco, for example. This animism, which essentially consists of attributing a spiritual essence to inanimate objects such as mountains, trees, or rivers, seeing in them a supernatural and religious power, was something that the Romans not only allowed, but embraced in their campaign to integrate the conquered provinces. This happened both through the integration of local deities into their ritual spaces, together with their own gods, but also through the association of deities imported from the Mediterranean East, such as Serapis or Isis, with the characteristics of these regional deities, all of whom were included as recipients of the sacrifices, whether they were bloody or bloodless. Many of these cults persisted for centuries, well after the fall of the Western Roman Empire, as confirmed, for example, by Saint Martin of Braga, who in his 6th century De Correctione Rusticorum criticizes sacrifices on high mountains and in leafy woods, as well as the construction of altars to the gods where they sacrificed blood to them, not only of animals but even of men, in the belief that they presided over rivers, springs and forests. The Suebi bishop and promoter of Christianization also points out that in his time, candles were lit near rocks, trees, fountains, and at crossroads. Many of these beliefs have remained alive to this day, and Catholicism ended up overriding some of them by integrating elements of popular religion into its canon, for example by associating saints with specific properties of older deities, or by building Christian temples on or near pagan places of worship. How then can we understand the Panoios sanctuary in the light of all this contextualization, combining what we know about the indigenous cultures that inhabited this place with the evidence of the changes implemented during Romanization, both in terms of space and cults? Over the last 300 years, various interpretative hypotheses have been put forward regarding the use and significance of this unique space. Contador de Argot saw the cavities as individual altars dedicated to infernal deities. Later, Gabriel Pereira suggested that the space could have a mixed function between the religious and the industrial, with some of the cavities being used for washing ore. José Leite de Vasconcelos, by interpreting the epigraphic inscriptions, concluded that Panoios was a serapeum, where various deities were worshipped, but with Serapis at its head, and here animal victims were sacrificed and mysteries celebrated according to the rites of Eastern religions. Later, Fernando Russell Cortes agreed with the interpretation of this sanctuary as a serapeum, hypothesizing that the large cavities in the northern rock were used for serapic baths, similar to those that took place in the sanctuaries of Asclepius. Romanian historian Scarlat Lambrino, who published a study on Panoios, also agrees with the idea that it was a serapeum, considering that the cavities and the epigraphic cartouches adjacent to them are related, and that the rites described in the inscriptions were celebrated there. However, the first researcher to put forward a unifying theory of the whole sanctuary within the framework of a wider ritual was Geza Alfoldi, who disagrees with the idea that Panoios is a serapeum. According to him, the candidates for initiation, called Mistai, would enter the sanctuary from the southwest side, advancing to the first inscription, which no longer exists today. There, each Mistes would read the text and be informed about what they had to do, in this case the immolation and sacrifice of the victim. The route moved on to the next inscription, facing north, where the Mistes learned that the severe gods presided over this sanctuary and that the building behind him was their temple. The candidate would climb up to the platform via the stairs flanking the inscription, burning their viscera over the rectangular cavities or quadrata. He then turned back and made a left turn, traveling along the west side of the rock, where there were 3 more inscriptions corresponding to cavities carved into the granite. It was here, in the second inscription written in Greek and Latin, that the Mistes were informed of the name of Serapis as the sanctuary's highest deity. The mysteries are also mentioned, which would include this revelation only available to initiates who knew the Greek language, thus separating them from the indigenous people. The meat of the sacrificial victim would be roasted in the attached round basin and consumed there by the Mistai. The basin next to the last inscription would be filled with water and used for simple purification. The ritual would continue through the southern temple, then on to the central section where there are more rectangular cavities, culminating in the Great Northern Rock, where the Mystères would undergo a ritual death, burial, and resurrection, finishing his initiation by reaching a new and splendid view at the top of this rock. Antonio Rodriguez Colmenero, on the other hand, agrees with Alfoldi in his refusal to consider the Panoia sanctuary strictly as a Serapeum. He interprets the space and the ritual journey carried out in it in a completely different way, including in his reading new pre-Roman elements that he himself discovered in that sacred space. Colmenero draws attention to the evidence of indigenous cults at this site, namely the aforementioned podomorphs, the serpentiform, the branch-shaped carving, as well as the circular depressions on the top of the large rock with the 9 steps, consisting of cup marks with small channels connecting them. The mention of the Lapithae in one of the inscriptions, which could refer to the indigenous people who settled here, and the geographical position of Panoias, set in a natural environment with splendid views of the Marão, which we know through epigraphic inscriptions was worshipped as a sacred mountain, point to an ancestral establishment of religious rituals in this location. It is unknown, however, what requests were made to this and other deities that would have been worshipped at this site, and it is likely that they involved offerings to obtain favors related to health, fertility, and protection against other dangers that could be warded off. After the beginning of the Roman occupation, the sanctuary probably went through an initial period of adapting the cult spaces to the needs and demands of the new rituals incorporated there, resulting in the carving of cavities, tanks, and steps. Colmenero suggests that in this period, Panoias could have been an open-air place of worship made up of small individual shrines. In a third moment, there would have been a transition to the final phase, in which the sanctuary became a more integrated space, marked by a ritual route between the various rocks and involving new structures erected there, corresponding to the intervention of Calpurnius Rufinus and the establishment of mystical cults of Oriental origin. Therefore, taking the Great Northern Rock of Panoias as a reference, the sanctuary, according to Colmenero, went through 3 phases of evolution. The first phase, pre-Roman, corresponded to the use of small rounded cavities at the top of the crag, which he suggests may have been of natural origin and then adapted to worship through small channels that connected some of them. The second phase, during the Roman occupation, would have consisted of the opening of the 5 large rectangular basins. The possibility of a wall on the western edge of the rock is suggested, at least in the section between the 2 sets of tanks. The third and final phase would be the excavation of the stepped levels around the 2 larger pools, with an approximately square perimeter, which would serve as the foundations for an outbuilding. This building would maintain the use of the 2 parallel pools, but would render the diagonal one unusable. The sacred area of the Panoias sanctuary that has survived to the present day is essentially divided into 3 main sectors: the northern, which includes the Great Rock with the larger tanks, the central, and the southern sector, where all the surviving inscriptions are located. All 3 sectors have cavities carved into the rock with different dimensions, shapes, and depths. What would be their function? Antonio Rodriguez Colmenero distinguished 4 categories according to their characteristics and relative position. The first, the cremation lacus quadrata, consists of 3 cavities, 2 of which are located in the large rock of the inscriptions and next to epigraphs 3 and 4, which have holes suitable for laying or fitting a grid, which would consist of 2 longitudinal bars which rested in rounded grooves on the narrower sides. With these two bars, other parallel bars could be crossed to complete the grid. These pits are all located in open-air cultic enclosures, which makes sense as they are spaces for cremation. Their bottoms are flat. Next to these quadrata, there are also holes whose function is unclear. Were they recesses for some kind of small banner or flag? Would they have fitted the bases of small statues? Were they used to contain liquids as part of the rituals and sacrifices? Its edges have a groove around the perimeter, which indicates the possible placement of some kind of covering or cover in metal or stone, for example, when the cavities were not in use. The second category is made up of lacus quadrata receiving liquids located in the open. This set of sinks, 2 rectangular and 1 circular, does not have great fittings, but it has a circular cavity at the bottom for collecting the last drops of the liquid they would contain. One of the rectangular ones is next to inscription number 1, located at the southern end of the sanctuary, while the other, smaller, is located to the left of the steps that would give access to the temple in the center of the complex. In the case of the circular cavity, located next to the Greco-Latin inscription, Alfoldi suggested that it also had a cremation function, but Colmenero disagrees, pointing out that the 4 rounded holes, located halfway up its interior wall, are not the same. He suggests these were used to place an iron cross, used to support a portable container filled with sacramental water for seraphic ceremonies, when the cavity itself did not contain the liquid. The third group includes lacus quadrata receptacles to contain bloodless offerings or sacred objects. They are located inside the temples of the southern and central sectors, thus corresponding to interior spaces. They have recesses around the perimeter when the rock level does not allow a lid to fit, but not along the entire length of the edge. On its 4 edges there are cavities, which according to some researchers could have been used to fit the ends of irons that would have acted as hinges on which a door could turn. Colmenero disagrees with this theory, pointing out that the perforations are not deep enough and that they appear not only on the larger sides but also on the smaller ones. It suggests that they were used to fit lids with hooks or rings, and the cavities were used to contain sacred objects that had to be kept out of sight. The fourth and final category includes the large lacus of the 9-step rock, a group of 5 large pools located at the top of the Great Northern Rock, whose function divides opinions. The 2 northernmost basins have flat, sloping bottoms, with the eastern one being deeper than the western one. The 2 tanks parallel to the center have 2 circular cavities at the bottom, located in their easternmost part, 10 cm in diameter by 6 cm deep, flanked by 2 smaller square or circular holes. What would they be used for? The oblique basin also has a rectangular cavity at the bottom that is 50 cm long, 25 cm wide and 8 cm deep, with a recessed edge for the apparent fitting of a lid, similar to other cavities visible in this sanctuary. Was it used to store a sacred object? On their edges, these basins have parallel channels that would be used to fit virtually airtight lids, perhaps, according to Colmenero, indicating an intention to protect the liquid contained in them from contamination by other liquids from outside. Their size suggests that they would have been used to accommodate people lying supine, i.e. lying horizontally on their backs, one of which is wide enough to accommodate 2 people. Were they used for ritual baths related to mystical ceremonies, or for rites of incubatio in which the participants would sleep in a sacred place in order to obtain divine revelations or cures? Rodriguez Colmenero argues that the ritual journey undertaken by candidates for initiation at the Panoyas sanctuary would be the reverse of the one suggested by Alfuldi, starting at the northern end of the complex on the large rock of the stairs. A small temple would have been built on this rock, using the stepped segment around 2 of the basins as a foundation, which thus became interior space and would not be used to contain liquids, but rather to fit or hold sacred objects in the cavities at their bottom. The rock would have had a large cartouche with a ritual inscription, now lost. The 2 other basins were used for ritual bathing and were filled with water from the autumn rains or collected from a nearby spring. Taking the Eleusinian mysteries as a reference, Colmenero suggests that the square depression would have been used to implant a sacrificial altar where a piglet would eventually be immolated. The Mistai would bathe in the 2 outdoor basins, simulating the bath at the Athens docks. The participants would then descend one by one, defining a line towards the center sector. The procession could be closed by the bearer of an urn containing sacred water. They would pass by the rocks with podomorphs, cup marks, and the serpentiform, integrating original elements of the sanctuary into the ritual. The route culminated with the arrival at the sacrificial area in the southern section of the sanctuary, stopping at the center of the large rock containing the inscriptions. The victims of the bloody sacrifices would be brought from the south side, and the immolations would take place there. The specific steps of this moment are unknown, but there are references to what they could include from epigraphic inscriptions such as those we saw earlier, namely the mention of animal offerings and the Suave Torilia. There are also representations of sacrificial scenes found in archaeological pieces, such as the bifacial stele of Nothelo da Pena, a bas-relief from the Frende triptych, as well as the sacrificial bronze axe from Castel de Moreira. After the immolation and sacrifice, the ritual continued with the cremation of the entrails, pouring the blood over the small circular cavities adjacent to the lacus and quadrata, and placing the Serapis container over the circular cavity. The inscriptions ordered by Calpurnius Rufinus would then be read out, starting with the southernmost one and ending with the inscription that has disappeared today, where the procession would end. Colmenero took Antonio Rodrigues de Aguiar's description of a tunnel carved into the rock as plausible, being located under or near the inscription in Greek and Latin, which would lead to the opposite end of the outcrop, where there once existed the rock with the carved footmarks. This cave, which would have been covered up by farmers who cultivated the land there, would have been about 25 meters long. Colmenero integrated this possibility into his ritual journey, proposing that it would end with the Mistai going through this tunnel, symbolizing the descent into the darkness of the infernal depths of the underworld, then emerging on the other side, facing east, into the kingdom of light. The existence of this underground passage has never been confirmed, and only possible archaeological excavations that may occur in the future at the Panoios Sanctuary may confirm or disprove this possibility. More recent readings, such as the one described in the book Serapis nos Confins do Império, coordinated by Rogério Sousa and João Ribeiro da Silva, argue that the thesis of a ritual journey that would unify all the spaces of the sanctuary does not correspond to reality. Panoios was thus a multicultural sanctuary where different cults and rituals coexisted, from the celebration of local deities, worshipped there long before the arrival of the Romans, to the cults that the latter brought with them, including them through inscriptions and alterations made to the rocks, with new cavities and religious spaces. The needs imposed by the bloody sacrifices led to the creation of a place to slaughter the victims, incineration sinks and circular perforations to contain the blood. Basins were also created to store water for ablutions and immersions, temples were built, and epigraphic cartouches were carved containing dedications and ceremonial instructions. However, this process of Romanization does not seem to have led to the destruction or even the disfigurement of the pre-existing sanctuary, preserving its natural character without taking the prominence away from the rock formations. The diversity of deities worshipped here, ranging from the severe gods, Manes and Noumena, to the Noumena Lapitearum and the highest god Serapis, seems to confirm the coexistence of indigenous and imported gods, although it was Serapis who presided over the entire sanctuary. This interpretation divides the Romanization of the sanctuary into two phases, which, in the case of the Great Rock, would have first been manifested in the creation of the two central basins. Then, in a second phase, the two northernmost basins were excavated, creating a stepped path around the first two. At this point, the length of one of the central cavities would have been extended, and the oblique basin was also carved out. These two phases would also be reflected in the central temple, with the first phase featuring hinges carved into the inner face of the entrance, allowing the door to open inwards into the small temple. In the second phase, the hinges were repositioned to the exterior, where a grate was installed. According to this theory, in the first phase of Romanization, the sanctuary was essentially dedicated to the severe gods, the angry gods, and the gods of the place. The center of these cults was the temple built into the southern rock, with the cavities inside it used as safes to store specific objects according to their size and shape. The inscriptions and incineration vats placed near them suggest that various gods were worshipped here, both local and infernal. The changes made in the second phase were related to the conversion of the space into a temple of Serapis by order of Calpurnius Rufinus. This would also have been accompanied by the introduction of new rituals on the Great Rock, namely the creation of a crypt for the celebration of the Serapic mysteries. The shrine that was built on the central rock, which has now completely disappeared, would have become the main temple given its higher position and the greater care in the preparation of its foundations when compared to the one that existed on the southern rock. Inside it, there are two finely carved cavities that would have been used to store objects or images linked to the cult of the deities venerated in Panoios. Previous analysis of this sanctuary indicated that the large northern rock also housed a stone temple. Its foundations would be located on the steps carved into the rock, forming a quadrangular plan. This most recent reading rules out that possibility, since the steps have a circulation function as a staircase and not to correct the unevenness of the rock in order to lay the foundations of a building. In addition, the central basin has been extended to the limits of the square, obliterating one of the steps, and the presence of the oblique basin would prevent a more solid and definitive structure from being laid. If such a temple existed, it would probably have been a non-permanent structure, a building that could be dismantled like a tent. The circular holes at the bottom of each of the center basins could then be used to fit support posts for a removable structure. As we can see, this place has generated different opinions about how it was used as a place of worship, reflecting changes in the historical approach itself and the evolution of researchers' understanding of the evidence. More than 3 centuries have passed since the first information about the Panoios sanctuary was officially collected. We have to thank those pioneers for their work, for despite some errors and omissions, they safeguarded information that would otherwise have been lost forever, like the descriptions of the rocks and the inscription that have now disappeared. How many other elements of this fascinating historical and archaeological site may have been lost in the centuries that preceded the accounts of the writers of the Vila-Real City Council and the rector of Valnogueiras, the result of the ravages of time, carelessness and ignorance. The knowledge acquired since the beginning of the 18th century has grown substantially, thanks to the efforts of many curious people and researchers who visited Panoios and gathered fundamental clues for a better understanding of the meaning of this enigma carved into the rocks. The various conceptions, conclusions and theories are edifying, but there is still a fundamental step missing to clarify, perhaps definitively, the full extent of the mysteries of the Sanctuary of Panoios, an archaeological excavation. How can we accept that one of the most remarkable and important sites in Portugal's historical heritage, internationally recognized and classified as a national monument since 1910, is still waiting for someone to take the initiative to carry out an in-depth archaeological investigation? How many more secrets does Panoios have to reveal? What new information can it provide about the indigenous peoples who inhabited this territory and who are still shrouded in doubt? Is there more evidence about the origin and identity of Calpurnius Rufinus, the sponsor of the remodeling of this sanctuary? Will we ever know what rituals this place used to host? These and all the other questions surrounding this rock-cut sanctuary are invitations to continuous research, exploration and discovery. The next chapters await whoever comes to write them. Thank you for discovering Portugal with us. If you liked the video, please click on the like button and subscribe to the channel to follow our new releases.